one of the things you mentioned there, which I'd like to get onto, don't know how deep we'll go into this topic because I'm assuming we can talk about it forever. But you mentioned a few times about being good internationally. But the first place that I'd like to start is maybe I was going to say we're starting to get more comfortable with this idea of a 2-year plan, but maybe that's not even true. But let's pretend that we are. Now you guys are starting to talk about like 3 years. So again, as much as you are happy sharing, what is your sort of 3-year steps, and then we can get on to the actual end goal and stuff as well.
First plan is to join a team where we can have freedom to do two things: establish a winning culture, according to how Mac and I view it, and establish a roster that that has all of the pieces that is needed to be good internationally. So that's a I'll elaborate a bit on that. So first of all, we need a full roster that can buy into to the sort of culture that we want. Like failing is a great tool to learn. Communication skills with each other, and being able to transfer knowledge and listen openly to each other. Um, Working hard, not being late, um, and being hungry and humble, which is like sort of the big one for us because we've had like we've had players in the past where you win LEC and it sort of felt like they reached their goal, like they were done. So finding a constellation of 5 players that are hungrier than LEC, and then building a roster that complements that, which sort of leads into what we talked about before of having um, a mixture of personalities, but also sort of like role players and carry players within the roster. Um, so ideally, you have a carry role and a support role in top jungle. Like they can be either. You can have a supportive jungler or you can have a supportive top laner. Um, then you there has been sequences where having a supportive mid laner has been successful for rosters. If we think back to Doinb and how successful he was, but for the majority of mid laners that has been successful internationally over like the last 8 years, the majority have been carry players. Um, Even though I guess you could probably argue that Faker is a bit of everything. Um, but when it really matters, Faker has typically been a carry player. We can think back to some of the shuffles on his Azir, even at this Worlds. Then you absolutely need a carry player on the ADC role, and you need a supportive role on the support role. Um, so those are like sort of like the team constellation. What we've ended up with, like for now, which is not necessarily the final roster in 3 years, is a carry top laner, a supportive jungler with the ability to play carry junglers, hopefully, eventually, a carry mid laner, a carry support, and Hilly-san. um, and within that roster, we currently have Hilly as the team captain, a role that is like very new even for us to develop because we haven't actually worked in captaincy like thinking before this year. Like we've soft done it in the years before. Last year, it was not something that was doable for us because of the roster constellation and the way that our players were in constant minus on their joint bank accounts. Um, but this was one of the big requirements that Mac and I had looking for a team to split, which is one of the big reasons why we ended up sorting Casey off pretty early on, because they were very intent on getting Bo and Upset as like the two missing pieces to the roster, which we felt wouldn't suit what we were looking for. So we got Hilly for Vitality, which is the first big step in like sort of our new paradigm for how to build a roster that is going to be long term good, is having a captain inside of the game, who can teach, who can direct the the way that we play the game together with the coaches. So rather than me and Mac deciding how we play League of Legends, we can now go through Healy consistently, or Healy can go through us with backup in a way to make sure that at some point during this year we're gonna play exactly the same League of Legends and we're gonna view it the same way. And that's the goal for year one. Year one is establishing the culture, a winning culture as we see it, and establishing a way of seeing the game in different metas jointly. Um, so that's year one in terms of like developing how we view League of Legends and establishing a culture. The second part to that is figuring out during year one whether or not the pieces that we have currently will fit into the scheme of being good internationally in 3 years. And all of this we have no way of knowing yet because we need to stress test them in best of three, best of five. How are they reacting when they're 0-2? How are they playing when they're 2-0? When they go international, like how are they coping with going to Worlds, being in a little hotel room for like a full month, playing on non-ideal setups? Can they keep their routines up? Can they keep playing well? Are they able to peak when it really matters? What is their relationship to their Asian overlords? Are they do they believe that they can eventually beat them, or do they show up with a mindset of, oh, I just got fisted by a showmaker, I'm so sad now? Um, so that's sort of the next part of year one. Like development is figuring out like how do we see our player slot into to competing internationally at a high level in year two, and especially in year three, which is when we realistically want to be good. Uh, so that's it. That's where we are currently. Year two is then gonna be if there has to be roster changes. Roster changes like ideally, and this is a big thing, right? Because a lot of the time you see roster changes being like 2 3 players, and whenever you change 2 or 3 players, you have to go back to year one. Like you cannot continue on year two. So even though you retain players and you retain coaching staff, you are now back in year one because you have to spend the first year, learning the game together. So hopefully, realistically, we are changing 0 players, 1 player, or maximum 2 players. That would be year one plan.
I think captaincy is something that we will see more and more in esports. It's something that I've always been passionate about just because of the background that I've had. I mean, the two sports that I played to, well, two of the sports that I played to a sort of semi-competitive level when I was growing up was rugby and football. And actually, the
Nice.
biggest thing that not actually a decent level, make that clear.
Same.
I was never going to go pro in any of these games, but just like sort of county-ish level. Um, One of the big things that I noticed a lot, even with the comparison of those two, is that in rugby, the captain role is much more defined and it's much more sort of specific. So you have a captain's run before your game, which is normally like the last training session ends with the captain leading it, kind of thing. And captains would be at least somewhat involved in some of the decision making. And I think that's a part that has been really successful when I started doing it very later on in my career with teams. The idea that someone has the privilege of being involved a bit in, like you said, how we're actually going to play the game, and they can have their opinion on that. But then on the flip side, they have the responsibility of, once we decide on a direction, they have to be the first port of call to like let everyone else kind of buy into that. And I think we'll just see it more and more, and a differentiation. It's great when they also are your leader in game, but as you mentioned with this book that you were talking about before, the captain class, it doesn't necessarily need to be like the loudest person who talks the most and who's non-stop talking in the game. It can be just someone who's most fitted for what exactly you want for the role. So just like with how you judge your team performance, like knowing what we want from our captain role and knowing how we're going to judge that, I think will become more and more standard. So it's great to hear that it's been being useful.
Yeah, it's been super useful, and like I said, this book really opened our mind that like we were sort of thinking about where we're gonna find a sort of a captain figure like this, because they honestly don't exist in esports yet, which just led us to the conclusion of we have to start creating them. We have to start helping players develop like the skill sets required to be a good captain. um and I think, you like you said, right, like esports is still in incredibly early days. So like, and sometimes I think we forget this, especially when you're so close. You feel like, oh, I've been here for 10 years, esports is old, but esports is so young. Like we are hundreds of years behind.
Mm.
um and that's why we take so much inspiration from traditional sports, right? Because like there's some pretty big consistencies in the most successful teams across like history in different sports, that they all do. So anything we can take away from that and sort of implement into esports is at least worth trying.